Hey everyone, welcome to the 21st series of the event From the Logic of Sense. It's in this chapter that we come closest to the definition of Stoic as we normally find it. That is, someone who unflinchingly endures hardship. Deleuze illustrates this with the story of a French poet named Joe Bousquet who got severely wounded during the First World War and wrote about his wound. He apprehended his wound as a universal truth, a pure event. He writes that his wound existed before he did, that he was born to embody it. Deleuze will say it's a question of taking the will that events produce in us and becoming a quasi-cause, becoming an operator, creating our own surfaces. Regarding ethics, Deleuze will say there is really no other ethics than to be not unworthy of what happens to us. For those who take the events of their life and feel that they're unwarranted or unjustified, it's always someone else's fault. Deleuze will attribute this to ressentiment, which is a French word that Nietzsche often used to describe the frustration, envy, and hatred that the what he called the slave mentality has. Ressentiment, the English translation is resentment, but it has a little bit of a broader meaning in French, and that's why Nietzsche always used the French. This notion of taking the pure event and doing something with it, making something of it, is very similar to Nietzsche's concept of Amor Fati, which Deleuze refers to in this chapter. Amor Fati means love your fate. Deleuze asks, what does it mean to will the event? Does it mean just to be resigned to death, to horrible things that happen to us? No, it's not a matter of resignation, according to Deleuze. That's just another form of resentment. To will the event is to discover it in its eternal truth, that is as pre-individual, impersonal. And here's where it gets a little paradoxical. Deleuze says that if willing the event is to release its eternal truth, the fire on which it is fed, then war would be turned against war. Death would be turned against death. So in other words, you take the event and you change it. You become a quasi-cause. Deleuze says that there is a volitional intuition and transmutation. Bousquet writes that he had an inclination for death, which he called a failure of will. He changed that to a longing for death, which he then called an apotheosis of will. So a longing for death is what Deleuze calls turning death against itself. If you have a longing for death, you don't want to die because then that longing is no longer there. Deleuze writes that changing from the inclination for death to a longing for death is nothing more than a change in will, from going from an organic will to a spiritual will. This spiritual will doesn't will what occurs, but something in what occurs that is something that is yet to come, that's in conformity with what occurred. It is in this sense that Amor Fati is one with the struggle of free men. Another way I've heard it put is that you can't change what is, but you can learn to like it. Or in the case of Amor Fati, love your fate, you can't change what is, but you can learn to love it. Along with the misfortune of an event comes a splendor and a brightness, which dries up the misfortune once the event that occurs is willed into a contracted and cutting edge in the operation. And this is all possible due to the static genesis and the immaculate conception. The magnificence and the splendor that we use to dry up misfortune is sense. So when he's saying the static genesis and the immaculate conception, he means a structure, us, that knows how to produce sense. So he's saying that when a event happens that brings misfortune, we are able to take this event and change it, to give it sense and to will it into something else, what he also calls a counter-actualization. The event is not what occurs, but it's inside what occurs. The purely expressed, in other words, sense. We take what occurs and we understand it, will it, and represent it as we want. Bousquet writes, become the man of your misfortunes. Learn to embody their perfection and brilliance. And once we will these events, we release ourselves from the events that occurred to us. Nothing more can be said than to become worthy of what happens to us, to will the event and release ourselves from the event, to become the offspring of our events, which Deleuze calls a rebirth, a second birth. Deleuze then shifts into a discourse on what he called in the last chapter the actor, the Stoic sage who identifies with the quasi-cause of the event. And he'll talk about it in relation to the two aspects of time, to chronos, which is the instant where the actor brings the event into actualization, and the ion, which is where the event, the pure event, exists, as it's always splitting into the past and going forth into the future. Deleuze will call this the paradox of the actor, where the actor acts in the instant of the actualization, but he's always anticipating something that's about to happen or something that has already happened. This is what Deleuze refers to as the role the actor plays. The role has to do with the concept of the ion, always in the future, always in the past, never in the exact moment, which is where the actor is. So Deleuze seems to be referring to the actor as what he earlier called the operator in terms of a quasi-cause. So the actor actualizes the event, but in a way that's completely different from how an event is actualized in the depth of things. The actor does it on the surface. So in other words, he's taking something that's happened and making it be something else, actualizing it into something else, becoming a quasi-cause for a different event based on a previous event. In this way, the actor acts out the events of his life. So the actor, as someone who is being a quasi-cause for a different event based on a previous event, he delimits the original, that is, he connects with the universal truth of it. He disengages from it an abstract line, and he takes from that original event only its contour and its splendor. And so we can see from the example of Joe Bousquet that he took from his wound only that which helped him become a poet and a writer, by writing about the wound, by becoming someone worthy of having had that wound. And this is what Deleuze calls a counter-actualization. Deleuze will say that humor is inseparable from the selective force, from taking from an accident and selecting the pure event of it. So to look at plagues, tyrannies, the most horrible wars, the comic possibility that they reign for nothing. To liberate for each thing its immaculate portion through language and will. And Deleuze connects us with Amor Fati. Deleuze will talk about the ambiguity of the pure event as opposed to the event actualizing in an instant. The pure event which is incorporeal and exists always in the future or always in the past, as compared to the moment where it happens in an instant. He'll turn to a writer named Maurice Blanchard, who wrote a book called The Space of Literature, and said that Blanchard writes about this ambiguity in relation to the wound and death. Whereas on one hand, death is extremely relevant to the body, to the person. It's grounded in the body. On the other hand, death is incorporeal and infinitive and impersonal, grounded only in itself. Deleuze will say that every event is like death, a double and impersonal in its double. And then he quotes Blanchard, who is coming from the point of the view of the ion. He's identifying himself with the ion. And the quote is, "It is the abyss of the present, the time without present, which I have no relation, toward which I am unable to project myself," because this is the ion. It's not in the present, it's in the either future or the past. "For in it I do not die. I forfeit the power of dying. In this abyss, the abyss of the present, they die. They never cease to die, and they never succeed in dying," unquote. And Deleuze will say that the they he's referring to is the pre-individual and impersonal singularities. So he seems to be saying that the way to not die, for someone not to die, is to identify with the spiritual, identify with the cosmic, to not identify with the I, to become part of the ion. Deleuze says that only the free man can comprehend all violence as a single event of violence, and all mortal events in a single event. When we reach this point of all events being a single event, Deleuze writes, and he finishes the chapter this way, "It is at this mobile and precise point where all events gather together in one that transmutation happens. This is the point at which death turns against death, where dying is the negation of death, and the impersonality of dying no longer indicates only the moment when I disappear outside of myself, but rather the moment when death loses itself in itself, and also the figure which the most singular life takes on in order to substitute itself for me." So this is a pretty powerful statement, basically Deleuze's philosophy about death. So Deleuze gives a footnote to a passage from Maurice Blanchard that's very much related, and I think it's important to quote verbatim. "The attempt to elevate death to itself, to bring about the coincidence of the point at which it disappears in itself, and that at which I disappear outside of myself, is not a simple internal affair, but implies an immense responsibility with regard to things and is possible only through their mediation. So that's a little bit of a mystery, but I'll leave it there and see you next time.